Hello, everybody, and welcome to Getting APIs to Work. Today, we say hello to Adam DuVander. Hey, Adam, how are you doing? Thanks for
Hi.
joining.
Doing well. Yeah, thanks for having me back.
Yeah, having you back. Yes, you're a two-timer now. So the last time you were here, you talked about your new book, Developer Marketing Doesn't Exist. And as part of your book, you also talk about documentation because it's part of what developers are looking for. And that's something we want to drill into a little bit deeper today. Can you please just talk a little bit about like that big picture, the book, and how documentation relates to your complete story sort of for the developer marketing subject?
Yes. So the idea of developer marketing does not exist is that to attract developers, you want to educate and inspire them, not promote at them. And so often we think of marketing as that kind of promotion piece. And so the reason the book starts, the first chapter is developer experience, is that that's foundational to how a developer will actually use your product. And so once you've attracted them, if you lead them into this terrible experience, which includes documentation for sure, then it's almost as if you didn't attract them. So so you have to start. You have to start with that foundation to be able to have something a developer would want to use.
Yeah, and that's a good point. So I think really, as a developer, you want to be able to use something. That's kind of your mission in life from that perspective. And if that thing doesn't make it easy for you to use it, then that's not good. And I think all of this plays nicely into the whole idea of API products. So just recently, we had Bruno Pedro here who talked about API products. And I really like this idea of thinking of APIs as products, even if you're not necessarily trying to sell them or market them externally. How do you think the API product idea and API documentation ideas, how do those two connect in your mind?
Yeah, well, I mean, it is the documentation is helping someone actually use the product. So what they see about how this works, and so there's definitely more than documentation within that, but that's that's how someone uses it, and how they understand how to use it, which I think is a key piece that sometimes gets missing in there. And I know we'll get into it as we talk about the things that documentation needs, but it needs to do more than just say, this is what this is, right? There needs to go beyond just the black and white facts. And in the same way that anyone building any type of product would want to explain that product in greater context than simply, this is the one thing that it does, right?
So I really think that if you think of APIs as products, then almost by definition, right, a product is meant to be consumed. And like you say, you have to explain to somebody how they can consume it. But for APIs, at least, I think we can also look at slightly different categories of APIs. So the categories that I like to talk about, and you could probably come up with different ones, but would be like private, partner, and public ones. How would you say the API product idea relates to those three different ideas of private, public, and partner APIs?
Yeah, from a product manager perspective, I would hope that they are very similar. But from a documentation and a developer experience standpoint, I think there's a lot more you need to do if you have a public API. And certainly the developer experience chapter in the book and the whole book is focused on those who want to reach a public audience. But then there are pieces of that are still very relevant, especially at the partner stage. You want to still tell the story of how this API connects to an ecosystem. And so that's still important at the partner stage, even if you aren't reaching developers directly, because often in a partner situation, it's a different audience at at the partner company, right? But then privately, there are still some pieces I think that make sense. Where you want to provide the same things that you would want to see in a public API, but the important thing is that I think when maybe people hear that, they think, oh, so now I'm being judged against this Stripe ideal. And I don't think everyone needs to be Stripe. I don't think every public API needs to be Stripe. And certainly on the private API fronts, that would be over investing to make sure that you have everything that Stripe has, right?
Yeah, exactly. Right. Of course, you could document every API that you have, like the Stripe API, but it probably would not be a good investment. Exactly. I think that's a good point.
On the flip side of that, real quick, is if you think of your audience for a private API being a colleague, then you would want to give them the best experience that you can, right? You don't want to just like the here's an open API, figure it out might not be enough for someone who works in the same company as you.
Yes, and also I think adding to that, right, if you really think about API products and all the wonderful things that you maybe expect from APIs, even internally, then, I mean, one of the goals that you have is that APIs are getting used, not just that they exist, but that they're getting used, right? And the easier you make it for people to really understand why it's even there and how it works and all of these things, I mean, there's a chance that you will get better API usage internally, and then it's a worthwhile investment. So you recently published a blog post where you provided, I think, a fairly convenient checklist of items to go through, and there are 9 items that you've turned into, or you've packaged into 3 categories. In my mind, the categories are kind of, it's a good thing to get started with the first one, and then the second one already is a little bit, let's say, more sophisticated, and then the third one maybe is really something where you say, well, we have to look at, what do we want to get out of this API? But let's start with the first one, which is providing a robust reference. And just let's briefly go through the 3 key points that you see that it takes to provide a robust reference to an API.
So the good news is, if you do have an open API, you can probably
you have.
You can probably pretty quickly handle these 3 things. And so, so the first one is actually listing on a single page everything that's possible with an API. Yeah.
Just one thing that I want to mention, right? I mean, Open API is a very flexible format. And if you see a lot of the open APIs out there, right, they don't necessarily have all the nice things in there that I think you would need to do the things that you are about to talk.
That is true. There are some fields that are optional that in my mind, as a developer communicator, should not be optional. Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So certainly having that sort of single list of endpoints is something that you should have in a reference. So being able to, I think of it as the control F. Can I, however good your search is, can I just still use my browser search to see what's on that page? And then really the examples, and this might be the piece that you're saying is sometimes missing, right? Is being able to show, what does an example request look like? It's one thing to tell me what the fields are. It's another to actually show what that looks like. And and that leads into the third one also, which is to have example responses as well as models. And the models is kind of one that comes along with the open API approach, but I've been seeing it more and more where there's kind of all right, great that you've shown me an example response. Now show me what actually makes up that response so that I can maybe quickly build a structure in my programming language that models that model. Yeah. So
plus you can, and you can use it for validation, right? So I think there's a lot of of useful things you can do with JSON schema, and then that is something where, again, right, it's something that helps developers to more easily use the API or more robustly use it, so to speak. Yep. Okay, so your first three things then are one page where I list all the endpoints, having example requests, and having example responses and the models.
With the models with them. Yep. And that's something I think could be useful across all three of the types of APIs that you mentioned. Yeah.
And that's, I think that's, to my mind, right, that's kind of the minimal thing where it's like, just do it. That's almost not even a discussion, so to speak. But then the next one, I think, gets already a little bit more sophisticated, where you talk about language-specific examples. So it's not so much just the API, but if I'm using language X, how does that look for me?
Yeah.
And there are three things that you are suggesting that people should be doing in that category. Can you please walk us through those three things there?
And so the overarching goal of the language specific section is, how can we get them from the docs to code? So something on their machine. I want them to make an API call on their machine. And so the first one of those is to show a curl request. So just to the kind of, this is out of the Stripe playbook, right? Of auto-populate a curl request. If you can put an API key or whatever form of authentication you'll use there as part of that curl request, even better that I can just copy and paste one thing. That, of course, gets to there are technical issues that might keep you from being able to do that. But even if it's 2 copies and pastes, I'm in my terminal and I see a result. That's good. So how quickly can I get to that? And so that's the idea of showing these within curl requests. And again, this is a piece that can probably be automated with tooling that's out there with to be able to just have that copy pastable and ready for me. Then it gets into a little bit probably dicier territory, which is SDKs for so being able to speak the language of the developer is an important piece, especially for a public API. For me as a Python dev, to know that there's something there that's ready for me to incorporate into my Python projects today is helpful. I think in an organization that's maybe a little less important, where maybe there are more standardized-ish language choices, but across groups in an org, it's pretty common for different languages to be used. So, and again, this is one where, so maybe you don't have your own SDKs for everything, but there's still a language approach that you can take to, even like at the very least, show me a call using the requests library of Python. Like that at least will get me a step closer to, again, remember the goal of this section is get me something that's on my machine that is making API calls.
Yes.
And so how can you do that? How can you get so with curl, you've made it to my terminal, but how can you make it to my actual code, right?
To your programming language, Yes. Exactly. I think that's actually a very good lead in to the third one, right? Not just into my programming language, but
so sometimes I might not want to just plop this right into an app that I already have. I want you to show me it in an encapsulated way. So let me play with it. It's not going to be the final place where I have it, but give me a sample app that's just a starter. Like gives me the hello world, wraps it in whatever it needs to be wrapped in to make sense, right, for that language. And so then there's something, a repo I can clone, something I can just copy and paste, some way to be able to not only get that single API call, but get it within the context of the language and of anything else I might need, which in an organization, there might be, oh, this API is often used alongside, this particular logic, or right. There's some additional context there that can come in that starter app. And making that that's the even easier way to get it on my machine and running some calls. Yeah.
Okay, now we have looked at the second set of recommendations in your checklist, which really is about getting somebody to the point, like you said, where they have like a running thing that makes a call to your API. And now the last section that you have, this is, I think, where it gets a little bit more interesting to think about how much do I want to invest into this, which very much depends on the thing we talked about before, right? Is it a private API? Is it a public API? Is it a partner API? And that last section that you have is about guides and tutorials. And I think, we can also see like the things that you're listing, it becomes more and more kind of laborsome to create them. I mean, they're very valuable, but it becomes harder to create, in particular, good examples of these things. So when you look at the guides and tutorials, what are the 3 things that you have in this category?
Yeah, so a way to get started quickly, then tutorials that go a little deeper, and then complete sample apps that are sort of the larger piece of that starter. So we can go through them one at a time. I'll say for the getting started guide, this is not optional for a public API. And it's this is one of those items in here that is its own item in the documentation or the developer experience review, which is the first chapter of the book that I mentioned, where you need to provide this walkthrough of, it can be a walkthrough of that starter app that you just built before. So it's just, how can we get that developer to hello world without just saying, here's the app, clone it, go do it. You need to provide some sort of walkthrough along that path. What are the things you need to have known? And what other important concepts about the API or the full product? Because for a public API, there may be a lot of things that you want to explain. And so how can you get those in kind of the just in time, rather than having, a lot of times what I'll see is someone will have a concepts section of the documentation. And often it's right at the top because they want people to know it first. So it's before whatever getting started they have. And it's like, I have to do this homework to just figure out what you could actually do. That should be embedded. The most important pieces of that should be embedded within the getting started. So what do you need someone to know in order to get to that hello world? Yeah. And it might be a point where, if you're thinking about your API program, where you can kind of tier your APIs to where there are certain kind of utility APIs that maybe don't need this, but higher level ones might need that walkthrough. And I kind of think of it as like, if you were going to suggest a movie to me, you could send me a link to the IMDb page for the movie and say, there it is, Adam, you should watch this. And that tells me one level of it has a synopsis of what the movie is, right? Like, it has the cast. I can click and see what other movies the star has been in, but it would be much more useful if you said, I liked this because it, reminded me of this other movie, and it has the guy from this movie in it, and it's this type of, right? Like, that sort of color around your recommendation would mean much more than the IMDb link. And so I think the getting started guide can be that.
Okay,
so
I can tell you're really particular about the getting started guide. Let's say you've made your point. I think you've made your point very well.
So that's, if I liked a getting started tutorial, I'm going to really like other tutorials for common use cases. So this is probably much more to the public and partner side, where there are multiple use cases that you want to be able to enable developers to build as quickly as possible, because they're common ones that you see a lot. And so where a getting started tutorial just gets them to that first call,
Yeah.
this is going to get them to the first success. So how can I not just make a single API call, but how can I actually build something that's a lot closer to
Get something done. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that really connects nicely. You know, it's like depending on how you design APIs, but I think at least in some of these approaches, you have this idea of API stories or whatever you call these things, right? Where you have an idea of, well, a typical user of this API, this is one of the things they do. And then that's even part of your whole design exercise to validate that what you're trying to design for actually can be easily achieved with the API. And I think then that probably would be just like the perfect candidate, so to speak, to then be turned into a tutorial at some point.
Yes, exactly. Yep. And being able to have it in as a so the last one is that sort of sample app to kickstart building, and those usually go right alongside those tutorials. Maybe you can have a tutorial without that sort of sample app that's a full. So this is beyond the starter app that we talked about before, which is more that first hello world. This is a functional app. And if you're going to have a functional app like that, there should be a tutorial alongside it, much the same as the getting started is alongside the hello world. And potentially you could have a tutorial without having the full app, because you're walking someone through a series of API calls that maybe you don't need to encapsulate in a full app.
But at least you can walk them through that kind of story, right? It's like, here's one of the typical things you might want to do. You use this API to, I don't know, create something, update it, check it out, and then whatever it is you're doing. And then I think that, like you said, right, that definitely is a good candidate for tutorial. And if you feel like it, so to speak, it also becomes a good candidate to kind of be like a supplemental material to the tutorial. You also have the sample app.
Yep. And on the sample apps, one thing I would recommend is not just burying those in a GitHub, in your list of GitHub repos. That's often what I'll see people do. It's how can you expose it where in another place that it needs. Like if you have documentation, it should be exposed there, and in addition to the GitHub repo. But sometimes you'll just see like a sample app link from documentation that sort of punts someone over to a list of GitHub repos, even if it's a GitHub search that's nicely restricted only the repos that are in that category. It still kind of doesn't have that additional context that someone would want to have, that most audiences would want to have. And so again, that might be a situation where internally, if I know the words that we use for things, so I can look through the list of repos and figure out which one it is that I need, right? Or which ones that might be okay internally. Whereas someone who's coming fresh would want to have a little more help there. Yeah.
That's for sure.
Yeah.
Okay. I think we had like a good tour de force, so to speak, of these different things that you put into the checklist. And for any API, I think that you are managing as a product, right? That I think is probably a good idea to at least go through the checklist. I think checklists I always like them. You know, you can use them in any way you want, but at least it's a good reminder of things to think about, and then you can still make this conscious decision to say, okay, I'm not doing that, but at least you have actively considered it.
Yes. Yeah. Consider it a checklist of the things you should consider. I think that's a good way to use the checklist.
Yes. But for the getting started guide, there's no discussion. You have to do that, right? I think I think we got that vibe very strongly. So that's good. Okay. Adam, thanks so much for taking the time. I think that was super useful. In particular, right, for anybody who says, okay, we want to see APIs as products, what is part of doing that? I think thinking about documenting them definitely is an important
Yep.
part of doing that. And I think having this checklist will help with that. Do you have any closing words for us, Adam?
I think on the product standpoint, I think just remembering that a developer who's coming to your API is going to see everything as part of the product, and that includes the documentation. So it's not really even a separate item, right? It's
no.
encapsulated within the whole API to them in their mind. So yeah, thinking of it holistically, the same way, the same approach you're taking to think holistically about that API. Remember that these 9 things are part of it.
Okay. Thanks so much, Adam. Thanks for joining. And you're now part of the Two Timers Club.
All
very
right.
elite circle. Okay. Thanks for taking the time. Thanks, everybody, for watching. I hope you like what you saw. If you did, please give it a thumbs up. Consider subscribing. And I think with that, we're done for today. Thanks, everybody. Have a good one. Bye.